Okay, IFRS 2 looks at share-based payments. So we want to, well, fundamentally, the aim here is that we intend to settle some type of liability, um, if you like, by issuing shares or share options, if you like. And that's kind of the issue here. That the issue is the fact that this will be settled in the future. So in effect, we're trying to recognize a provision of sorts. It's the same idea. How do we recognize this provision? But the whole idea is that we intend to settle via shares or share options. So again, we are incurring the service now, if you like. So typically this is really used to compensate employees. So the question here is, we can see straight away that we're going to be debiting expense, but the question here is, how do we recognize the provision? And typically this is a service that's offered over a period of time. So the question here is, how do we recognize it as we go along? So the standard requires us to recognize this when the transaction takes place, but it'll be inconsistent, wouldn't it, not to recognize this transaction? Well, really, the matching concept and really the definition of liability, if you like, from the conceptual framework. So relevance in terms of it will be material for our for liability not to be recognized if we don't show that. Going back to the definition from the conceptual framework of relevance, would the omission be misleading to the users? So IFRS 2 requires that all share-based payments must be recognized in the financial statements when they take place. And I've just sort of written out here that omitting the expense would reduce comparability. It just wouldn't be sort of true. The recognition of an expense receives strong support from investors. So we have that, and so I think that's the first bit that we need to be clear about. And so typically, the next stage or the next thing to ask ourselves is what type of recognitions can we have in terms of what can take place. So we can kind of have equity settled share-based payments or cash settled. I'll talk about equity first. So literally we intend to give shares in our organization to these individuals, typically people working for us, employees. So typically debit expense or in effect really some other component of equity. So first thing is that before we transfer it into equity, we have to wait until the shares actually vest. The key date to focus on is the grant date. So typically there will be conditions attached, but the price agreed at grant date is what we use as we go along. The initial grant date, and we wait until we get to typically until we get to vesting. So typically, I'll talk about modifications in a second, but typical conditions are attached. So in terms of the conditions that are attached, the key points to realize or to pick up on here, IFRS 2 states that an entity should account for services as they are rendered. So we need to, so over a 3-year period, you need to kind of, like a classic provision, provide for the first year and then for the second year, and then finally, so you're just really topping up the income statement with whatever you need to get you to the second year, if you like, right? So I mean, again, this is not, I'm not doing the questions, but the key point is you're adjusting year on year. So almost like a bad debt provision, but always adjusting to that point through the income statement. So the conditions, the market conditions, are already taken into account already. So we don't need to to kind of think about those anymore. It's the non-market conditions, and these are the things that we need to take account into: how many people are left, whether or not they have achieved the profit targets, and that's what we use to decide as to whether or not we can recognize that at that particular year. So those are your market conditions and your non-market, your market conditions and your non-market conditions. Right, now in terms of coming back here, very jumpy. In terms of IFRS 2, so typically once we recognize that, first of all, there are no further adjustments after the vesting date. This is to do with equity based, by the way. There are things to think about when we're talking about cash settled, and I'll come to that. But in terms of modifications, just like any provision, if during the remaining period there are any additional expenses over the period from the date of the change to the vesting date, we need to then spread out that adjustment over the remaining period up to the day of vesting. So in a way, it's like adjusting a provision. And of course, any cancellations, of course, or any payments made in effect reduce the liability, right? In effect, we're reducing the liability, and any additional payments made in excess of the fair value, we would account as an expense. So that's kind of those are the issues there. Um, Now we have this issue of the second type of um, settlements. We can have our cash settlements, and these are based on the entity's share price. So we have promised to give out some shares based on the actual price of the share. So we debit expense and we credit liability. And so in effect, based on how the share is moving, we will pay out to the to employees, for example. So debit expense, credit liability. And but what's different here, what you must do is you must look at the fair value at each reporting period, because this is really liability. This is a liability. So in effect, we want to make sure that in essence, that's what's really going on. There's a variability with that liability because we need to make sure we satisfy the liability. So you have that fair value recognized at each reporting period, and you're adjusting for that. Now, post the vesting date, if you like, owners of these shares may hold on to the share, and in effect, when you now pay out post the reporting period, we focus on the intrinsic value or the actual real value of the share now that they have it, not the market value. So someone's currently holding a share for £1, the market value is £8, the intrinsic value is £7 to him. That's really the inherent value in that. He already has it for £1. So how much would he exchange it for? You'd have to give him £7 for it, really, because he already has it for £1. So we would then de-recognize it at its intrinsic value when we basically pay out on that share, on those shares. And that's kind of what's going on with share-based payments. The key point is you need to think about, just go through, be clear about the years. So for example, 3 years. So if, I don't know, whatever, 200 people and then 20 left and then 20 were expected to leave. So you now would then say, well, if this is during this year, of course, 20 leave this year and 20 are expected to leave over the next 2 years. So you're really looking at 160 times whatever number of shares. Imagine it had been 100 shares each times whatever it was, however much the grant date price was, times a third. That's the first year. And for the second year, I'll do the same thing again with my new estimations, 2/3, sorry. And then whatever the difference is between the when it was 1/3 and 2/3 is what I'll put through, like any normal provision. Anyway, I've spoken for too long. But that is share-based payments in effect.